Welcome to the 6th grade writing scoring calibration webinar for narrative writing. This is a tool to help teams get ready to score their post-on-demand writing and to get calibrated. At points, you'll want to pause this webinar to get some materials or do some scoring and reflecting. So I'll try to alert you as to when those times may be. But also feel free to pause whenever works for you and your team. Before we get started, let's talk about the materials we'll need today. We'll need a copy of Writing Pathways, which is in your curriculum bundle from Lucy Calkins. And then we'll also need some materials that you should have gotten from your instructional coach, including the exemplar packet, a word list, your 6th grade narrative rubric, scoring sticky notes, and then finally, you'll need your students' post-on-demand assessments as well. So if you'd like to pause the video to get those materials ready now, please do so. So to get oriented into this work of scoring writing, we'll start with taking a look at what narrative writing looks like on a progression. So for this process, you'll need the writing samples for grades 4 and 5, and those will be found in your exemplar packet. They should be copied a different color than the rest of the exemplars. The 4th grade sample is called The Trials of the Bathroom Break-Ins, and the 5th grade sample is called Goosebumps. And then you'll also need your writing pathways to look at the writing samples from grades 6 and 7, and those can be found on page 222 through 226. So for 6th grade, go ahead and read sample 1 on page 222. That's called Personal Narrative. And for 7th grade, you can read the sample 1 as well on page 224. That's called On-Demand Narrative Writing. Interesting titles. So go ahead and with your team, get those materials out and read these narrative pieces. Read up through the grade levels, noticing what writing looks like on a continuum. We want to get a feel for narrative writing at each grade level and notice how the writing changes through the grade levels and pay particular attention to what is significant about 6th grade narrative writing. So please pause the webinar to do that work now. So now that we have a feel for what 6th grade writing looks like and where it lives on a progression of narrative writing, let's consult the 6th grade Common Core standards. So the standard for narrative writing appears on this slide and the next one. So take a moment to reread the standard, thinking about how this might show up in the work that you see today. After reading through the standard, pause here to discuss the connections you see between the standards and the unit you just taught with your colleagues. Okay, some quick notes about looking at student work. We want to notice the trends in the work that we see and think about the strategies that successful students used, and also consider and make note of teaching points that we can tuck into future lessons. We also want to remember to always rely on the student evidence, what's actually in the writing, and measure where that lives on the rubric. So now it's time to get calibrated. So what we'll need to get started with calibration is your 6th grade narrative rubric, your student sample from the exemplar packet, scoring sticky notes, and your word list. We're going to get started with a cold score of this first student sample called Look Up and Watch the Show. So a cold score means that we're just going to jump right in and score the sample using the rubric. You may want to score with a partner or a team if your team is small enough. And remember to really dive into that evidence and see where the writing lives on the rubric. Pause now and conduct this first cold score. Okay, now that you've scored the student sample with a cold run, let's take a look at the calibrated score of this paper. Take a moment to compare your scores to the scores on the screen and make observations of agreements and differences. Keep in mind the analogy that we like to use of that two-lane highway when we're scoring papers. We may be a point off or a half a point off in some of the subcategories, but as long as our scaled score comes out to be the same, we're pretty much calibrated, which is what we're aiming for by the end of this webinar. Also, make note that as we look into the annotated sample of this paper, some of the scores that are on this final sticky note have been adjusted, and that's because at our last 6th grade wide calibration meeting, the team decided to move the scores a half point here or there. But again, we stayed on that two-lane highway. So just a heads up that as we move forward, some of these scores may be a little adjusted. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. So go ahead and pause and take note of similarities and differences now. All right, let's jump into the breakdown of the calibrated score for this paper. In overall, this paper scored a 2.5. This paper reads like a story. It's a personal narrative. There is tension and anticipation that builds, and it's a meaningful moment for this writer, and she goes to great lengths to show us that. However, it's not quite that 3 end-of-year expectation for 6th grade because it's lacking a lesson or a moral or a strong theme. It's definitely an important moment and it's written well, but it's reaching up to that end-of-year 6th grade expectation of communicating a theme. For lead, this paper scored a 3. The lead sets the story in motion and it hints at the larger meaning that's coming. I had been waiting to see this my whole life. For transitions, this paper also scored a 3. This writer has great control of transitions using the basics like finally and then between paragraphs to move the story along, and also using some more complicated transitional phrases that show passage of time, like 5 years before, and here we are an hour earlier. For ending, this paper scored a 2.5. The ending connects to the meaning, but is a little bit more telling than showing. The ending starts out by saying, "Now I have done it. I can tell myself I will never forget the first time I ever saw the fireworks. Now I understand." It's very much a telling paragraph. It wraps up the piece very nicely, but if it would have showed instead of told those sentiments, it would have been a lot stronger. And with organization, this paper scored a 3. The organization is strong with purposeful paragraphing to show time and setting changes. Okay, here is where you'll see some discrepancy in the annotated sample and that calibrated post-it note that we looked at before. So in the annotated sample on the screen, elaboration is shown to be a 3. And when we got together as a group to score this paper, we decided that elaboration really was more of a 2.5. So this student definitely elaborated. If we take a look at elaboration on the rubric for 6th grade, it starts out with the writer developed realistic characters and developed details, action, and dialogue, and that internal thinking. Yes, the writer did all of these things. But where we're lacking is that last little bit in elaboration that says contributes to the deeper meaning of the story. And again, if this story would have had a strong theme or a lesson attached to it that the student used elaboration to get us to, it would have been a strong 3, but it's still a very nice 2.5 in elaboration. With craft, we also decided to bring the score from a 3 to a 2.5. However, this craft in the craft in the paper is still very strong. We wove description and figurative language throughout the piece. There are varied sentences to create pace and tone. The setting and the action bring forth some meaning, and the language speaks to meaning. So a very strong, crafty piece, but we need a little bit more in terms of bringing about that lesson or theme to be considered end of 6th grade expectations. For spelling, this paper scored a 3. There were less than 3 spelling errors according to our current word list. But in punctuation, you'll notice that the score has changed as well. There were a lot more comma errors in this piece, bringing the punctuation score down to a 1.5. So again, if we're taking a look at this student sample and its calibrated score, we have a total score of 28 and 5/10, meaning a scaled score of 3. So even though we made those adjustments, this paper still is a strong representation of end of the year 6th grade expectations on the whole. So now it's time to check in. Are you feeling calibrated? If you feel really good and you're ready to go off and score, you can do so at that time. However, if you and your team need a little bit more time and want to look at some more papers with us, go ahead and continue with this webinar. All right, if you'd like some more time, let's take a look at the next student sample in the exemplar packet. It's student sample A, let's call it, and it's called Band. What we're going to do is score this paper on your own now. When you're done, compare your score with your partner or team members, and then resume the webinar to see the calibrated score. Remember to really dig into the evidence in the writing and see where that lives on the rubric. Go ahead and start this work by pausing now. Here is sample A's calibrated score. Go ahead and take a moment here to compare your scores with the scores on the screen and refer to the rubric and evidence in the writing to talk out and settle any major discrepancies. Again, keep in mind that 2-lane highway. We're aiming for that same scaled score. If you'd like to work on one more, let's repeat that same process you just did with sample A with this sample. Let's call it sample B. Go ahead and score sample B on your own. Pause the webinar now. Here is the calibrated score for sample B. How does your score match up? Is the scaled score the same? If so, you're probably feeling pretty calibrated. So thank you for engaging in this work and getting calibrated through this webinar. Remember to reflect as we score papers. Think about how far your writers have come in their use of strategies, and also what teaching points you can still offer them as we move forward. Happy scoring!